You ready? Hello, everyone. Brian, can you hear us okay? Awesome. Today we're bringing to the research series Justin Sachs, who we've been fortunate enough to have here all semester thus far. Justin conducts research on commons making through Commonizing Studio. He's currently a research associate for the Digital Goods Network at Lancaster University in the UK. That's not how they say it, but an adjunct industry fellow at Griffith University Center for System Innovation in Sydney, an administration manager for the Design Research Society. Commonized Studio is an outcome of Justin's doctoral research for his PhD in design at Lancaster University. I can't stop laughing. That's not how they say it. Prior to starting a PhD, Justin worked internationally for 20 years. Playing Keith. Prior to starting a PhD, Justin worked internationally for 20 years in the field of community-based economic development. I'm going to turn it over
Who's
to
they?
you. Where she is.
Lancaster. Okay, well, anyway, I wrote that. Thing here. Okay.
Very differently.
We'll start then. Hello, everyone. So I'm gonna focus. This is a bit strange. I've got a computer here and you're here, and so I'm saying hi to you online as well. So my eyes are going to be not at the camera, which is a little strange, but I see you and hear you online as well. So this presentation is called Designing Commons Through Studio Experimentalism. I'm going to explain all those terms in the next couple of slides. I want to also thank a few people who are responsible for this research happening. So all of my work is in collaboration with other people, mostly so far other design researchers, and that has included Dr. Rosende Galabo at Lancaster, Dr. Marcus Fernley at PolyU, and Dr. Julia at Pace. And so this wouldn't have happened without them. So first, I'm just to walk you through what we're going to do very quickly, because it is quite a packed presentation. First is the why. So why do I care about this topic? Why might you care about this topic? And I'll explain this kind of interaction between design research and commons research. Next is one part of the word Commonized Studio. So Commonized, so what does that mean to me, and where is the origin of that word? Next is studio. So what is studio pedagogy, which will probably be new for most people here, and what is studio experimentalism within that? And then I'll move on to experiments. So I did have a control group, which I'm not going to talk about in the presentation, but we do have pilot experiments, which are experiments with people in advance of trying to do them with the community, but it didn't maybe happen within this time frame. And then field experiments, so actual projects for commons making with communities. I'm going to walk through two in the presentation. One is Soil Trust in Hong Kong, and one is Hack for Blood in Botswana. And then finally, some of the implications, particularly for common scholars, because that's the kind of most of the audience here, through this research through commenting, as it were. So I want to first do a land acknowledgement. I haven't seen this too much yet, but it's relevant to this research. So I want to recognize that this presentation is happening here on land that has been seized from the homelands of the Miami, Potawatomi, Shawnee, and Delaware peoples. And the reason this matters is because my research is about how do communities create commons, but specifically how do they create counter-hegemonic commons. And counter-hegemonic commons is a strange word. It comes from diverse economies literature, which is where my methodology is rooted. Other words we might use are anti-capitalist, counter-capitalist, post-capitalist. But what it acknowledges is that there are many kinds of ideologies, and the land acknowledgement is one way of highlighting for us that just calling this Bloomington is an active ideology. We're always engaged. We're never neutral. And so for people who might find this a strange question, is recognizing that we are always practicing ideology. So I'm specifically interested in how people make commons. And so this is this relationship between design and commons. Specifically, we have all this knowledge about commons and how they work, but it's not accessible to people. They can't use it to actually make commons. And on the other side, as you'll learn from the studio side, designers have processes, but they're completely inaccessible to other people too. So how do we make them visible to each other in this shared endeavor of making commons? And some of these photos are from design research. It's been going for about 10 years on commons making, and that ranges from mobile app prototyping on the left to building artifacts and games. So the first thing, just to set the tone here, is defining commons. One of the biggest challenges I often have is how to explain it to people. And one of the other challenges I found in the literature review is no one ever documents how they explain it to people. And so I'm trying to get better at doing that, because often I don't even use the word commons. If you looked at the video I did for the Brazil project, I don't even use that word. So This is a slide from the project in Botswana where this is the sentence I used. And that is, a commons is a shared resource that is governed by the community of actors, not the state or private market, who depend on or are affected by that resource. And so some of the terms that I use now are community governance, that resonates with people as a concept if they've not heard the term commons. I talk about actors. Some of my research is on more than human commoning, so commoning with non-human species. And so this keeps that space open for different kinds of actors. A lot of people say outside the state or state or market, or outside market and state. One of the challenges I found is market is a really agnostic term. There's lots of kinds of markets, and they exist beyond capital. And so private market is a way of explaining that this is about. And lastly, you'll see here, I talk about dimensions. So I did start off talking about digital commons and physical commons, but that becomes really complicated. And I now just talk about them as shared resources, and we have dimensions. So in this case, we have a physical dimension, digital dimension, and a cultural dimension to these commons. So that's how I talk about it with the communities I work with. And commonize, as a synopsis, originates from my work around ideology in commons, and specifically commonism, as kind of the most shared kind of counter-hegemonic ideological term for commons. All these books actually come out of the arts and culture field, so it's interesting to see that that's where kind of this critique is coming from. But what I notice for a lot of people is they have trouble articulating this process. So we have privatized and we have nationalized, but what does it mean if you actually want to turn a resource over to the community? And so I created the word commonize to give a label for that. And so that's where that word comes from. The hashtag or #. I'm terrible with social media, but I recognize that that is kind of, in the modern parlance, how we want to share ideas. And because ideologies and economic imaginaries only exist as shared mental models with other people, the # is kind of the closest we have to kind of the equivalent of a shared idea. And then finally, the studio is a way of asserting economics as a design subject. We tend to reify economics as a thing we can know and study and understand. But for me, economics also is a series of decisions and choices, and it's a design process. So that's the origin of the term. Studio pedagogy is something I think is probably new for many people. And the short answer I have for that is an education in making things. So design research is the study of making, usually human making. We're branching out though too. And it's a signature pedagogy. It's been around for several thousand years. It's how we've taught people how to make things, from houses to recipes over millennia. And an important part, the epistemology of studio pedagogy is reflection and action. And you can see it here, which is embodied knowledge. It's a combination of what we think of as scientific knowledge, but also based with tacit knowledge about how things look and feel and taste. And that's really hard to document. And so usually studio pedagogy often is documented as snippets of dialogue, because that's how you can capture those conversations. But that presents a challenge for what's our data and how do we share that and record it. And finally, critique is a huge part of studio pedagogy. For anyone who's, I'm sure many of you have been in a studio course, you're seeing on the right as a desk crit. So what I would do with students every week, and you're working with their physical objects, that could be engaged in the actual process of making with them. And again, that is drawing on this reflection and action and knowledge and action. So it's not always just, what the data say, but actually how does this respond in this environment. And on the left, we have kind of peer critique. So another element of critique is working with others. And there's also public review, where you're sharing this for review. So those are kind of just a highlight, big parts of studio pedagogy. When we talk about experimentalism, studio and artists have been conducting experiments forever. We just don't often, we're really bad at talking about it that way. And I've used a different quote here to kind of explain what does it mean for when we talk about studio experiments. And that is, the purpose of studio is to enhance the ability of students to consistently generate successful creative works. The goal of studio experiments is not to create a process that you can replicate and have the exact same results as you would for a lab. That's a sign of lab success. This is a process, and we're saying, okay, if we give students the same things, design principles in a space, can they successfully create a commons, or whatever the case is, in their context? So 20 people will have 20 different correct answers. And that's what success looks like in studio experiments. What I've taken here are photos from 2 economics labs, right? Believe it or not, these are called lab experiments. And my point here is that this is a problem because we aren't using the language of studio since it's not known. So the left photo is from the Donut Economics Action Lab, and the right is from the P2P lab. Big fan of both, so I'm not downing these. But ironically, with the Donut Economics Action Lab, there's a whole section about, economists meaning the designer at the designer's table, and then somehow they become a lab. When in fact, they're very clearly engaged in making processes, and they're documenting this as a way to share with other people, not to duplicate, but to try out these same processes in their context. And so really my concern is there a way for us to draw out what studio experiments are so that people who are involved in commons making and other forms of counter-hegemonic economics have kind of a growing database to draw from. So I will now move on to some experiments. So I'm going to do 2 slides on pilot experiments. And so these were experiments that weren't ever used with communities. And the first one is going to be really about scaffolding and kind of knowledge construction. And the second one is going to be an example of a typical design method adapted for commons making. So a big feature of my work with other people was how we support other people to become commons makers, right? It requires knowledge of a whole other field. So how do we go about building that knowledge? And so this is very much grounded in critical pedagogy. It is a two-way street. I am learning from them, and that affects my process as much as I'm also sharing with them. So on the right-hand side, and again, don't need to read these words. I'm just kind of showing you the images. These come from papers. Because we're academics, so we build our knowledge through writing papers. And so this on the right-hand side was a colleague, Bazili, whose his area is ecosystem visualization. And so we were looking at, well, how could we apply kind of ecosystem visualization and the position generator method he was using with choice levels as a way to visualize choice levels within a commons, particularly because we were looking at a federation of commons. On the left side with Rosende, we were looking at how we take the question of how communities identify and adapt tools to support their making processes. That's his focus. And so we looked on the top row, you'll see the IAD contextual factors, saying, okay, well, if we know that that's what needs to go into a commons, maybe we need to signpost communities to saying, okay, these are the kinds of factors you're going to need to think about. So what kind of questions would they have to ask? And then how would we help them identify tools to use? And then how do they go about adapting those tools for their purpose? And I'll show you one example of the tool on the next slide. So in design research, we have tons and tons of tools for making, and they're very often in the service of industry, but they can be adapted for commons as well. So on the left, we have the service blueprint. This is very common in service design. And so the purpose of this kind of tool is to help, say people are experiencing, a backlog, they're unhappy. We could use this process to figure out, okay, what's going wrong with the service and how do we improve it? Or maybe they want to see, can we find ways to make you spend more money? So where are the opportunities to do that too? And so I was saying, okay, well, that makes lots of sense for making a commons, right? Where it is essentially a type of service, except our relationships are different. We don't have a service and the customer, we have commoners. But how do we kind of make this accessible to people? And so on the right-hand side, this is, again, not something you should be able to read. It was from a couple of experiments with students around a more than human commons, where we're looking at a shared green space and thinking about bees as our non-human member. And how would we actually go about accounting for and bees in our commons? And so the top row is yellow, and I'll just explain these rows because that kind of, I think, makes it kind of clear how this kind of model would work. So the top row is called customer journey typically, and so we're talking about the bees' journey, so food, water, shelter, so thinking through what they need. The green row is the front stage, and so a big part of service blueprint is usually talking about stages. So we have front stage and a backstage. And yes, we absolutely use live action role play as a way to do this. And performance and live action role play are used frequently in design research and have been very successful here in getting people happy and kind of empathizing with the situation. So the front stage will be the garden, right? What the bee experiences. The backstage is maybe your house where you get the water, but the bee doesn't actually go there. And then the gray row is the support. So tools and technologies you might use to support your process. So that's just one example of kind of ways to experiment with tools that are in service design and design research more broadly, and they can be adapted for commons. So now I'm going to go through 4 field experiments. 3 are part of the Soil Trust in Hong Kong, and the last one's from Hack for Blood. And I'm going to go through these first 3 in kind of a rapid succession because it kind of shows you the evolution. So this was a community of people who were upcycling food waste from their household using bokashi-style fermentation composting, which is layering your food scraps with rice bran or straw in a container, and then you bring that to the farm and then put it in the ground and compost it. And so we were first asked, and there was a concern about how do they start to document this practice to share with others, both for external stakeholders to raise money, but also to bring on new members. So that's kind of this driving question here, why we need to actually document this. So we started off with this Commons Model Canvas, which is an adaptation of the Business Model Canvas, which you might have heard of if you're in kind of entrepreneurship. It's a very, very common tool in startup land. And it's a way to visualize, particularly collectively, what is our business model. So here, what is our commons model? And I won't go through all the words here, but this was drawing on a number of other literatures like social practice theory and traditional ecological knowledge theory. And what we learned from this process, though, was that it got incredibly crowded. And what that told us is that we were doing too much, which is a good lesson also for startups. And the issue here was that the soil was the resource, but you had people doing composting and you had people doing farming. And he had been treating them as one commons, but actually they were two separate groups, really. So it helped us visualize and understand, well, actually, we need to treat this as two separate groups, are sharing a resource, but are different groups. That's the main takeaway. And decide not to use this with the community. What we decided to use with the community was this, which I've called the action situation canvas. And so we're going to see this gradual granularization and like narrowing down to action situations and then to interactions and then getting more and more embodied. So this was kind of the first of several experiments where I really focused on using something called I called the action situation statement. So one of a big part of design is framing. So how do we, how do we by framing the situation, that is framing a problem, which is a political act, but it allows us to go on and try and solve something. And so I created the action situation statement as a way to try and frame the discussion with the group. And so that's the center row, and what it says there is members produce quality vetting at Tinea. And so the features of the action situation statement are the actors, who, the interactions, and the place, where. So members, they're producing this bedding, which is the straw for the compost, at this warehouse. And then we adapted language from a number of frameworks in these quadrants into kind of more lay language. So on the top left, we have things we need, which is the materials. The ways we do it is methods. Do's and don'ts is a kind of a nicer way of saying rules. And in verifying our progress was kind of something that actually the comments maker here came up with, and that was really moving into the interaction side of these frameworks, so the monitoring and compliance, but again, hopefully a friendly way. And what is also a nice example here is in terms of generative design is, I created a template. This is what he produced. It might be prettier than what most of us do because he is a designer, but you do whatever you want to. But he also saw this opportunity to use the verifying our progress quadrant as a pivot to think about other things like sanctions and dispute resolution. So I didn't come up with that, he did. And so that's a great example of when you're educating other people with this knowledge and they're using it in their context and they have the right tools, they can go on and make new things that are better than anything I would do. So we did that, and as you can see, the community participated, but the kind of sentiment was like, they did it, but maybe, it was kind of fun, but like, that was where it ended. And so we then lead into the last experiment into what I call body histories, like oral histories. And this is actually what people want to do. And this is not really shocking, but it presents a real data challenge. So you can see, I don't know if you can see really with the mouse, but they're super happy, like dipping into those fermented fugacci pins with their hands. And this is an example of embodied practice, right? So this is how they want to transmit knowledge through doing it. It's pretty logical. So it made sense. It's one of those things where you're like, why did we not kind of just embrace this earlier? But it took a while. But it also encapsulates this concept of knowing in action, which is, again, from an epistemological perspective within studio pedagogy, the guy on the left. That's knowing in action. How are we supposed to turn that into data? Like, how is he going to record that and share that? That is actually how we transmit knowledge, but that's how we share practice. So the challenge coming out is this was highly successful. They took the stage, as it were, and how do we then begin thinking of this as experiments with data that can be shared and replicated for other people? The last field experiment here is from Botswana, and you don't need to know the context here, but as a really interesting example, this is a good example of we wrote a visioning paper and kind of of how to address lack of trust in the healthcare system, right? This is blood donation. This is a common issue everywhere. Rather than saying, well, we need to teach people how to trust the system, well, actually, how can we engage people in governing the system so that it's trustworthy? And in Botswana, they happen to have an intact common system called the COLA. It's a village governance system. It was around before we were talking about commons. It's been a study of common scholarship. So you have this intact local village system that can act as a community governance system to work with the National Blood Transfusion Service, that's the government agency, on governance. And so we did a paper, and then I said, oh, we're interested. So it was very exciting. And the left side is kind of what I gave the community. And I'm showing this because it's showing emergent patterns in my practice, which is not to say it's right. The whole point is other people will try things and they may have other approaches. But what you see there are these kind of 4 features that are kind of now recurring. I'm giving you the abridged version, but they're kind of showing up more often now. And as the actors, the interactions, and the place as a way of framing this. An action situation statement that's not visible there, but for example, are we talking about blood transfusion in a village at a mobile LAM unit? Are we talking about a hospital? And also if we're talking about transfusion, which is the other side of the equation, where is that happening? And so getting them thinking through both of those scenarios And then finally, verification and how we know. And verification matters a lot when it comes to transfusion, because the concern was we don't get the blood when they want it. So how do we actually create some accountability? The right side is what came back to me. And so and this was a good example for me of like, so they did paper versions, these were turns into giant A1 pieces of paper on the wall, and they digitalized them. But it also taught me that I had to figure out how to embed instructions within what I'm doing and what people give back. And increasingly in my projects, we're doing audio tours. So kind of like you do the slides and like, it's a video, but you're kind of like walking through people through it. No one really likes writing stuff down for the most part, but we're all okay. We're like doing videos. So we're increasingly moving towards like, okay, let's record a video talking through this, because then we can make sense of it. So findings. So this is the kind of some of the findings that came out of this that I think are relevant for people in the room today and online. So the first is this idea of studio experimentalism. It wasn't part of my original plan. It emerged from this research of this question of like, well, how do we document what's happening? And so I think if you're engaged in comments making, you can't use kind of lab experiment techniques and analytical processes, because it's a different approach to understanding knowledge. And so how can we make this more available for people engaged in comments making? The second one is around comments making as a process. My practice tended to I started to make sense of it over 3 different kind of types of activities. The first is I call scaffolding, which is what most of us mean in terms of education. I showed you that with the knowledge construction slide. The second 2 come from the design research. So one is infrastructuring, and the third is institutioning. So infrastructuring, I don't think is unique to design research, but it's basically creating figurative infrastructure to help people in making these comments. And so most of what I've showed with these methods would be considered infrastructuring. The third one is institutioning, and that is in design research means actually changing the organizations to respond to these new realities. So I'm acutely aware of what institutions are for our institutional economics. That's not what they mean here. And the third one, I think was particularly relevant for those who are still involved in doing kind of analytical research, is this role of what I've called common or sustainment activities. You saw it most readily in the body history slide. A really big part of commons formation was how we recruit and motivate and train and retain commoners. And if you've been part of a community organization, you probably have done this, you've done some training. You probably also have had experience with an organization that has fallen apart or descended in some way explicitly because of this issue. Particularly, pandemic was a big challenge. And I don't see this in the frameworks as a variable. And so one question really is that maybe that could be a cause of changes in the commons, this specific issue. And by doing this work through commenting, I identify kind of this issue as maybe something that needs to be kind of thought of as a variable in future frameworks as a way to see maybe that's what's actually causing changes. It's nothing about these other factors. So that is it. This is a really new research area before really I'm kind of the first in doing a lot of these things. And so I welcome any of you if you're interested in how you make your research accessible to communities or harmonized resources, then get in touch. That's it.
Got the cue.
I talked really fast. I can see now. Oh, I'm so sorry, everyone. So if you didn't understand anything, let me know. This is a lifelong problem. Like, oh, we're done really early. So yeah, you can ask me to repeat stuff. I apologize.
Okay, Jess?
No grads?
No students? All right, Jess.
So this is really interesting and something that the first time learning of it. So, but some of that is complicated by sort of forum that you're sitting in, right? And so the question I'm interested in understanding is, first of all, like the goal, what you're doing appears not to be to produce a research paper that could be a side effect. Is that accurate? Which is totally fine. I just want to make sure that, right? Because my next question would be, what is the research question? But if that's not the goal, then that's not a helpful question. So I just want to clarify, it seems to me you're more interested in sort of documenting how and when, and then under what conditions you can successfully instruct communities in the making of commons.
Right. So, and I included, not that I wouldn't read the annotated portfolio attached to the event. I realize it. I love how I'll put it there because they all ask us to. So I do have research questions, but they look different. And so part of this is also, I was like, well, I do lots of papers. I do the 80,000 word thesis, but part of this is I want to bring you into another world and see like, This is not about creating papers. This is about creating infrastructure and creating what is it? Communities don't really need papers. What do they need instead? So the research question about what they need is driving all my research, and that has driven that does create this kind of a thesis. But in terms of being here, my questions were how I'm focused on how I help people create commons, and I call this making the generative turn in commons research. So how do we move from analysis to creation, and how do we use what kind of different methods and tools? Okay, yes.
Okay, yeah, so that's super interesting, especially because if we think about, and I've struggled with this question as well, of like the way that the idea of the commons development, sustainability as an institution, institutional entrepreneurship there's not a lot of address in Ostrom literature that this would come from the outside, right? The general idea is that this is self-generating, maybe through some trial and error, right? And so I'm curious how you're thinking about your role there. I understand that you are not suggesting like a top-down approach that we then just give to all communities. I recognize that's not what you're talking about, but I am sort of curious of what that does imply for your role vis-a-vis how we have traditionally academically thought about how commons emerge and are made.
Right. So great question. So one of the things that's easier for me in design research is design by nature is interventionist, right? We don't grapple with like, oh, we're intervening, like design is intervening, right? We are changing situations. I hear a lot of people using Herbert Simon as their, and Herbert Simon's a kind of a crossover artist in design research. And his definition of design, which I don't agree with, but is about kind of moving from existing situation to a preferred, right? You have to change things. So our questions are not about whatever changing, we know that. The questions about what is the role of the designer? And so there's certainly a lot of movement around co-design and participatory design around, what those relationships look like and how we involved. And I don't have an answer. Part of this in such a new area is we don't really know. Part of it is just lots of room. I will say I had a control group in this. It was a group where I did nothing. We were making a speculative digital speculative data trust. I didn't talk to them about commons, and I didn't talk about ideologies. And we never talked about the word commons in that entire process. And so there's this question of if you don't say anything, what happens? And we created incredibly neoliberal commons in the end. So it wasn't intentional. But it was like, well, what if we don't do anything? Like, how, the goal really is to intervene as little as possible. Particularly because I did this during the pandemic. I wasn't there. Right? I have never met any of the communities I've worked with. Right? I have focused intentionally, usually with just one person, and then they've gone on and done the work with the community. And as a model, I would continue on. So that is what is the role? And that is I can't help it in terms of other disciplines, because that's an issue other disciplines grapple with, like, are we intervening or not? In design, we don't have that problem. All of our work is with communities usually. All of our work is, we acknowledge our position, we acknowledge our ideology, we acknowledge that framing is a little well back. So we don't have that problem as much. And perhaps that can be useful for other people. Like I'm working with a design anthropologist as part of this one project, and design anthropology is navigating that space between ethnographic study and, well, we're actually going to give them something that's going to change their culture. So how do you navigate that? I'm not sure that answered your question, but
yeah, just a really quick follow-up is just sort of grappling though with the sort of inherent like intellectual lineage of what it means to be a commons, right? Generally tends to be not without an external actor entirely, right? Because there's lots of work to understand that not that the state, for example, is absent, right? It's just that generally the ideas of the ways that the rules for management of the resource, the ways in those participate is entirely largely internal. And I'd be willing to engage with some pushback there if people disagree with that. And so it's part of it's whether what role you were playing, but the other question is how do what you're fundamentally doing is both interesting and also a divergence from how we expect commons to emerge and function.
Right.
And so it's not just about whether you're intervening or not, but that what that means about how we think about how commons can.
Well, and I didn't have a slide, but so one of the things that really came up is an unstated part of this kind of commons formula. We have kind of resources, commons, we have commoners people, and we have rules. Is ideology or worldview. It's not stated, but it's there in every commons, and we don't talk about it. But the reality is a commons can be lots of kind of things, and it depends on what your worldview is and what worldviews that people coming into it bring into that commons creation. And so that's a little bit of what I try to, kind of tease out here is we don't think about that aspect usually, but that's because it's there. And there's critique from elsewhere about the lack of the political. And so if we know that it's the political and ideology is there, then how do we engage with that? Which is recognizing that ideologies are formed as well and change. And so if we're just gonna sit back, then no one knows anything. So anyway.
Davo?
Well, again, very interesting stuff. And then, so two comments are really very different. So the first one, maybe to even scale up some of your ideas. So it's one way of thinking is that you have different forms of organizing cooperation or some activities, including markets, governments, commons, and etc. No, but what happens is I would call it, maybe you don't want to call it technology, but essentially the constant benefits of using these different organizational forms could change over time. It could change because of the circumstances, but can also change because of the technologies that we have to using one form or the other. It could be cheaper to use the market because now it's easier to spread information, or maybe you can use governments because governments now they can monitor some activities that whatever 1,000 years ago they were not able to monitor. And then maybe one way of putting your where is your overall research is, well, what I want is to provide tools to reduce the cost of using commons to organize cooperations. And then here you come a bunch of technique tools. I'm not finding the right word for that, to reduce the cost of using this form of organization. So and then that's kind of interesting because you can go to some kind of all but interesting discussion is what is the proper form of organizing different activities. And then the way I see the long run question institutional analysis that part of the problem is that we are looking for a good match, and then we are looking for bad situations in which you have a huge mismatch between what you try to solve and what type of organization you are using to solve that. So, okay. So that's the first comment, but maybe it's kind of an umbrella of what you are doing rather than specific comment of what you presented today. And then the second thing, it's I was very interested when we were talking about how ideology plays such an important role. You mentioned this several times. And then maybe you have something interesting to say, because when you are using commons, you are relying more in informal mechanisms to monitor, to punish deviators. So in some sense, we shouldn't be surprised that ideology plays much of a role, because maybe you need to call ideologies to enforce that the allocation of resources under commons more than, let's say, under markets or governments, maybe, no? So maybe connecting with this idea, it's like, because you are using more informal mechanisms, maybe there is more room for ideology, or maybe I completely misunderstood how you are approaching ideology, okay? Anyway, so those are my two comments, very different.
Right. I'm not sure. Was there a question that I?
Yeah. So essentially, I don't know. The second one, the first one, no. The first one, no. The second one is like maybe clarification of how you are understanding ideology, and if it's correct the way I'm thinking, it's more as informal mechanisms, or maybe ideology has a more important role than, let's say, when you're using markets or governments or firms.
Well, so I think ideology is, I like Kim Stanley Robinson's definition, which is very simple, which is this: it's an imaginary relationship to a real situation.
Okay.
It is, we cannot go on in the world without it, right? Literally, we would be paralyzed, because is this a private product or a commons product? It's what you decide, right? Your worldview informs how you view everything. There's probably in some ways, it's actually a reverse process. So where we're observing, particularly outside of the global north, ideologies around commons are much more embedded because they're much more, people are relying on their communities much more than they are the state or the market to actually serve their needs. And so in many ways, a lot of the work has been about not trying to introduce this language, but hearing the language that people are already using in their context and just in working with that. In particular, in a lot of cultures, the word commons doesn't exist as one word, it exists as multiple words because it's, again, it's an ancient form of governance. And so they don't want to say it's this one word. It's like, well, it happens here like this, you know, it happens here in this way. It is perhaps true that it, you know, it's more complicated when you're moving out of something like a private market because we all think we have a shared understanding. We don't always have one, but we think we have a shared understanding of what this all means. And once we're moving out of it, we'll say, well, what is this, right? And sometimes that's hard to understand, but sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes the community understands, and so it's really for the designer academic to just understand that worldview. It hasn't really, you know, so yeah, I mean, you know, in the Botswana project, I mean, there were, you know, they were bringing terms around, it's in some of the papers, they actually wrote some papers, you know, around Ubuntu and other terms that I wasn't, you know, it's trending, but they're leading on that. In the Brazil project, we started off with the idea of Mutirao, which is kind of self-help, but is more ephemeral. So like, you know, that was one example. And yeah, so it's all over. Oh, and there's some chats here, I see that too. So yeah, so I'm not sure if it's more, it's just that it is, it's more, if you're studying making, you need to expand your kind of view of, in kind of thinking about ideologies there, because that is what people are relying on to create these spaces. So perhaps, so I don't really know, it maybe is the answer, but that's how it's come up in my research so far.
Diego?
Well, first of all, congratulations for all of this work. For me, I have a different approach, just relating like when you started to define, like we don't try to do things equal and over. I really need to look up your biography because I understood there is something artistic behind your architecture degree, because how we artists think, at the same time we do Tchaikovsky 5 has to be a different one. That's the way that we think. And it also implies our way to see the research. We don't see it as we have to publish a dissertation and books, and that's not the way we believe the research is the final product. Therefore, I understand all of what you are doing. And in a way, even Jamie did a presentation, I guess, last year, talking about the Ostrom workshop thinking and how the artistic mindset is implied in what we do in the Ostrom workshop. Like, we don't try to replicate, we actually do the same that you are trying to do, allow everyone to generate new ideas, and that way we will learn from each other. Therefore, I believe actually it's very, very on the line what we're doing. And that makes me think about two things. First of all, you are saying that it's very difficult to actually understand all of the logics that is happening during the common making process that you were saying, like, we have the post-it, but we have to actually record a video in order to understand, meaning there is so much information that not only the things written can actually explain. Therefore, I have two questions for you in that sense. That is, which kind of mechanism have you analyzed or discovered during this process in order to recall that information? One is videos, of course, documentaries, I'm not sure. But have you tried, for instance, to put all that, like the non-formal institutional arrangements written, and how is the difference between 200 pages between a 5 minutes video, and how is the relation between that and the difference which people can access that? And the second question that goes more into what Gustavo was saying is, there are things, and culture is an element that we analyze is the best ways to go as a cultural common element, because it allows all of these interactions. But there are others that probably could be private sector, others that could be government sector. And in these kind of experiments that you are doing, have you identified these kind of differences, and which one will be better on one on another, or how the commons solve problems within them?
So the first question, what is the second question? Can you just
Okay, the first question was,
I got the first one.
okay, the second question is around, now I forget.
Well, that helps a little bit.
Okay. It's too much for me even.
Go for
Yeah.
the first one.
Okay, well, I'll do the first one.
I don't know.
So the first thing is, in a sense, so this is kind of the next frontier what you've asked. You know, and because, you know, I'm under pressure, my PhD dissertation has to still be 80,000 words. I don't get to just say, here's a video. But it also took a lot of learning. I still, you know, I still, you know, come around to that because I'm like, oh, I do like writing, right? So in writing is helpful, but you know, it became clear through these projects and then doing this, our current project where it's multilingual and like, it's just easier to do videos. And so that's kind of this question, which we're going to try and experiment with in my current project that I included in the portfolio, to see like, well, how do we kind of do audio visual tours for each other as a way of explaining stuff. So I haven't done it yet because we were really focusing on like what I can put in paper documentation because is required of me. But feeling like that's actually just pushing me in the wrong direction for what commons people need. And there is this, so there is this disparity between trying to be an academic and doing this. And one of the reasons I'm not pushing for a research paper, because I know it's not going to help. It could maybe help academics, maybe, but it's not going to help the community. And so, yeah. What was the second?
That was precisely my second question. Like, one thing to prove to your point, sure could be, is precisely talking how we are going to define one non-institutional arrangement thing. How much time is going to take to write that? How long it's going to be? Who has access to that? We are going to do it in a video again and try to manage both. And there are going to be obviously differences there.
One thing that emerged, I don't remember, I talked about briefly with the Commons Model Canvas, was this acknowledgement of externalizing versus internalizing activities. And so some things we're doing to strengthen our commons, and and that's mostly what I've been focusing on. But some things we're doing because we need to communicate with external stakeholders, often maybe a funder. And in recognizing that those tools and those processes are different, and so we can be pragmatic. We're going to have to write this down and turn it into an application, even if you don't want to, because if you want the money, then you have to do that. But that's different than, okay, what are we doing to actually help our community actually get better at commenting? Completely different. And so that's kind of one learning point that came out of this process, is those kind of two different types of activities. I don't know. Did that answer your questions?
Yeah, and the third one is around if you consider commons is the solution for everything, or in your experiments, what you are seeing.
So as a diverse economy scholar, the answer is no. There's never one solution to everything. There's lots of different solutions. But as a scholar, I have to be really specific about my research area. So I'm really looking specifically at commons and specifically kind of what does it mean around kind of counter-hegemonic ideologies and commons making. So absolutely not. There's lots of, and part of what we learned in this research is like, people have lots of words and lots of explanations, and I often get questions like, what's a cooperative versus a commons? And really, I don't have a slide here. What I focus on, I have another term called commonized design, which really speaks to the idea of political agency and economic agency as kind of these two features of design. And so political agency is having a say, which is very, very, designers are pretty good with that, with like involving people in a consultation around a park. But economic agency is actually controlling the resource. So, you're a consultant on the park, but then you actually get to keep on managing afterwards. And, other popular terms are decentralized design and distributed design with blockchain. And you have kind of economic agency, you can participate in those alternative systems, but you don't really have any vote. You can't change how they're going to work. So it's kind of that pairing of both. And it might be that those two things can be applied for lots of other types of forms other than commons, forms yet to be discovered and used. So no, absolutely not. I try to be very specific because, doing academic research requires that of you.
So hi, Justine. I'm sorry that I was late, but I've been very lucky to hear you before, and I wanted to thank you for sharing your work. I do think this question of how people defend the commons, make commons, sustain the commons is a key question of our times. Like I think it would be absolutely relevant in all the potential that commons have to undo enclosure, privatization, monetarization, a lot of things that we know are at the root of many of the disasters that we're facing. So that definitely I truly appreciate. I wanted also to say that I really like that you pay attention to the process and not the result. I think that is key when we think about commons, and we tend to think of commons as something that is already given or as the result. But then in the process of doing in common is really key for precisely the commons. So I think that is a very important part. I have a comment and a question. So my comment is that I would disagree on this idea that people don't need the analysis. I think, you know, from my own experience of doing a lot of community organizing, a lot of community-based research, we do need more theory. We definitely need more theory. And these communities, these people is actually producing very sophisticated theory all the time. And we, the ones who have, you know, the opportunity, the privilege, the chance to really work as knowledge producers in that sense, to really contribute to movements through making those papers and those, you know, that I actually, you know, I would agree with you. I would have agreed with you 20 years ago, but now I'm totally convinced, you know, from all my experience that actually community organizing, making commons actually needs this theory, this very sophisticated theory that, you know, comes in different ways, as you all mentioned. Because I see it, you know, doing research as making worlds, and doing research is actually key for doing commons. If we want to make other realities, we want to make common reality. So I think in that I would disagree, but I absolutely agree with you that we intervene all the time. That I think that, you know, that many social scientists would say that they don't intervene, or that they intervene without doing harm. And I think that is a big lie. We do harm, we intervene, and in doing that, we create worlds. So it is so important to think about the things that we do, which is usually, you know, one course on methodology, one quick IRB procedure that we all hate, but that is actually what we should be thinking about. But yeah, again, I'm also getting old, so I now have this moment of talking grandiose about many things. And my question was about how do you see, you know, how do you understand precisely the people you're working with? How do you see, you know, definitions of community, a lot of the critiques that are, you know, very old about what communities are, and that part of community making that is completely attached to making the commons or commonizing.
Right. So to respond, and to your comment, I appreciate, I agree with your comment in the sense that there is a need for theory. The question I've been grappling is like, in what is that form? What form does that take? Right? What does it look like? I gave you some examples of like how I try to digest that, the kind of, you know, things like the action situation rules for the community, for the commons makers. In response to the second question, so this the pandemic created a certain requirement, which is that I couldn't actually meet with anyone, even people in my own town. And so that kind of required a certain process, but it had an upside. So all of my work has been remote. And now when I originally started, I did when I was back in Wilmington, and I kind of tried joining some communities to, you know, I was gonna do kind of more ethnographic work. I was gonna be involved, be part of this, you know, community learn. It was, well, those timelines don't work for academia because it takes forever. And I had like, you know, a year. So, and there's expectations of you, right? You're a member. And so it became really problematic. And so what instead I ended up doing out of necessity was who needs what I'm offering here, right? I know about commons and I'm kind of design savvy. So, you know, who else needs this information? And so other people are like, oh great, I'm doing this work on commons making and I could use this help. I mentioned briefly, my work in all those examples, I've learned to do with one person who I call the commons maker. I can't work with the whole community. It's too hard, it's too difficult. There's could be language issues, you know, timing and arrangements. I focus on working and supporting. It's kind of like a coach type relationship in some ways. One person in that community to do what they want to do. Now, what that means is, I'll call it the kind of unreliable narrator problem. Right, I have no idea what's actually happening. Right? I'm relying entirely on their reporting back on what the process is. Now, what that usually means, though, is they're usually over zealous. So, I mean, it's not usually a bad thing, but usually they come saying, "Oh, we're going to do this, this, and this," and then we work and spend all this time on doing something, and then they come back and say, "Oh, actually, they weren't so excited about it." these are not the worst problems to have, but that's most commonly the problem is that like the commons maker is a bit more enthusiastic than the rest of the group. But that is, I would feel like that is the root, that's how it works. And so I'm not explicitly trying to, I'm not a commoner, I'm not part of that community. I'm supporting a commons maker to do what they want to do in their context. And it also means, for example, someone asked me in the panel around agonism, like, well, what about inviting people into the, stakeholders and stuff? And, I don't. If they want to invite someone, they do. I can see it coming a mile away, like, oh, this is going to happen. I've been here before, but so I have to kind of just let that be and just be there to support them. And I can make suggestions, but it's up to them. So that was born of necessity, but it's also really great from a scaling out perspective because I can do work all over the world. I don't have to travel anywhere. I don't have to go anywhere. And there are trade-offs to that. But that's kind of how I've dealt with community is that distance.
I'd like to defer to Brian. I always like his question.
Okay, cool. Yeah, he's next.
Good.
Let's just get ready to type. You're next.
Neat
Oh,
stuff.
wait, we're gonna have to
Thanks
turn up the
for-
volume, or hold on, I can do it on mine.
Can't hear you, Brian. Yeah.
Ready?
Hold on a second.
Okay. Neat stuff. Thank you. Thank you for all this. And my question in terms of the commonize in part would just be the simple one, to the extent you've looked and thought about the literature on that's framed in terms of commoning, what do you see as similar and different and so on? And as more of a comment, this relates to what I see as this kind of fascinating situation where you have a bunch of people who think in turn and talk in terms of commoning, and a lot of them are quite aware of Eleanor Ostrom and maybe aware of the workshop and other things. And David Beaulieu is the kind of exemplary person there. On the other hand, they're off practicing in their own world. And at least to the extent I'm aware, I don't see a lot of dialogue back and forth. I don't remember in my memory, David Beaulieu even coming and presenting at the workshop. He doesn't show up at the Commons conferences. Again, there are these kind of different worlds and different ideas about what commoning can be and how people practice it. So well, as a reflective practitioner, well, what do you think?
So, right, so really,
Wait, you gotta let me.
go. Okay, so I think the really basic question behind my research at this phase is there any use to this literature, right? Because we're not using it, right? All these people doing it are not talking about, they're not referring to it. Design principles get some airtime. So there's a bit of work around, and there's in design research, there's some work around design principles, but that is it. So when I look at their design literature, the only use of commons concepts is 3 papers that actually build on design principles. And I think it's probably the case kind of more widely, people aren't, even in the commons, as you mentioned, like they're not using it. So there's this first question of like, is it useless? Like, is this decades of knowledge like have no purpose whatsoever, or could it be useful? And so these experiments are also me saying, well, like, I attach kind of my explanation of like action situation rules to say, well, actually they do seem logical. The language is really hard to understand, but once you understand the language, like they just describe really mundane concepts around like how people make decisions. So is this his first foray? I say, well, before we just dismiss, decades of research, like, could it be useful if we, made it available? We don't know yet. And we acknowledge that people aren't using it in communities because they're not going to read these books. So, and even if they did, I'm not sure it would be useful because the ID framework tells you what a commons looks like and how it would function. It doesn't tell you how to get there. So what are you gonna do with it? I would think I still don't know how to figure out how to get there, and I'm dedicated to this. I don't expect a community person to. I think your other question about the research around kind of commoning and commonism, was it about commonism and commonize? Is that the other, you're muted now, I realize, yeah. Yes, is that right?
Talking.
The whole literature and discussion very much framed around commoning, some of which is quite informed or analyzed by people coming from like workshop and that kind of thinking, both in terms of rural resources and in terms of literature on urban commons. And, my take on some of it is a lot of that is very much more concerned about asserting control over the commons rather than how are we going to create this and manage that. But again, the broader question is commoning versus what you're looking at in terms of commonize.
So so they're all pieces of a puzzle, and in a way, again, from common literature, try them all, right? Like this is such a new area. Try everything. I don't know, like we don't. There's gonna be lots of different options. Some words will like. Some people, people really grab onto commoning. Some people like commons. Whatever works for you really what matters. What I will say is in the design research, they kind of leapfrogged. So they started off with a very sophisticated understanding of commons and this entanglement between commons and commoning from the start. So we kind of had the joy of not having to kind of grapple with that process. The commonism, as when I looked at just very briefly, why are people using that term? I was curious, and really that comes down to asserting one, an ideological break with communism. People recognize there's a very similar kind of spelling, and communism really is at this point defined as a state-led approach, and this is not state-led. The other one is also to define this as a proactive approach against capitalist subsumption. And so that's kind of why they're using that term, and that's who's grabbing onto it generally. So, but the answer is, I think they're all good. I don't really have any definitives, try them all and see what works. That's part of this experimentation process, is to see what gets people going. Community governance. So not even the word comments at all. There's a question that I'm trying to read.
I can read it out loud. So obviously this is a long one. How about if I have you respond to this we're running out of time and it's going to take me almost as long to read this. So Mike's in the room. You got a quick one in the room?
Quick,
and then of course we'll keep talking.
Quick comment, not really a question. When you talked about the importance of ideology in making commons, it reminded me of Keith Taylor, who's been here for several years, is at UC Davis right now. He wanted to study and does study cooperative, and he really had trouble finding a home in academia because business schools weren't really interested in it because it was different, and there just wasn't any sort of fit. And I talked to him about this because it seemed the perfect fit to the workshop, because it's people working through a common sort of stuff, and but he said it's like a movement. It's like there's ideology. It's not really a cooperative unless you buy into the whole set of principles that are behind the cooperative movement, sort of in the US, and Germany has a lot of it too. And that just created him a whole lot of problems sort of in trying to fit in with academia. But I think sort of the happy ending is he ended up very nice position, UC Davis, where he's basically the equivalent of a agricultural outreach sort of person in like an agricultural school, different places, sort of in an ag econ sort of arrangement. So there are places that you sort of fit in, but having that ideology really as part of what he was trying to study and help create really generate a lot of problems academically.
Yeah, so part of my question is, where do I fit? I have 3 academic positions, but I don't consider myself in academia. I do projects with people on stuff that allow us to collaborate. And it's interesting because with the ideology stuff, I don't think it's not where do you mention or not? I decided to kind of go for it here because we already are at a commons group, so we can kind of build on that. So I don't actually know where I fit because maybe one of the challenges is, so that's an ongoing question. Should you figure that out for me? Let me know. I'm happy to look at it. And I think one of the challenges that anyone who's in this field is working on is being pragmatic about fitting in to get inside, but also not being asked to do work that feels incredibly in violation of principles and goals. And it's hard to know where that boundary is going to be sometimes.
It's a journey.
Hello, everyone. We're officially out of time. I sent you the link that's in the question that was in there, and BloomPad is Greg Bloom. So I was just like, talk amongst yourselves. But I want to thank everyone who was here. This was, as always, a lively conversation. We have one more week of colloquium and research series, and then it's a Thanksgiving break, of course. But don't forget, Mondays we'll still have activities here in the workshop throughout the end of term. We have a couple of events, even though it won't be a colloquium. So please still come in. And Justin, thank you for your work and for being here.
feel free to go.
I will, thank you.
First.
It's always time just to
Yeah.
someone sort of hanging at the end.
Yes, you haven't actually.
Try to explain it to this. That's how.
How are you doing? Like an evening?
I
have.
kind of like.
I was like, Angel, get this now. I'm like, I mean, I can do it.
Yeah, no,
I mean, I'm also trying to control the lens. I'm like, I can
Right.
write stuff, I'm like, I can-
right. That plus,
So you're leaving next week, right?
yeah, exactly, you ended right, you should talk to Mike more, but you ended right where you need to be. What do I do with this? Because what I'm doing is what I want to do. It's important. You heard some.
Really like.
That's what I'm.
Well, that's what I mean, that's kind of.
Like it very much conflicts with the academic.
Could.
Depends on
You have.
I mean, part of it also, part of it also is, you'll have to, I'm not, I've entered academia quite late, and part of it is.
I started out really in IR.
This kind of work before, and I didn't see how I fit in. Because I'm recognizing, I'm open to it, I mean, I'm very academic, academic in my way. Is where does this fit in? And I recognize I'm giving you like the full on kind of counter jump, the ideology.
Yeah, I like to do.
I could, obviously not bring that up in certain circumstances, but like, I don't fit into an economics department.
Right.
You can't, I'm not gonna. Like design, unfortunately, design departments, what they're teaching and what the research is happening are really far apart. And like here, for example, there's no PhD programs.
I can tell you that.
No, it's a-
some.
A lot of some ways of.
I don't, I was at, that could be like, yeah, I mean, chaos, right?
No, my point being is what you consider knowledge. Exactly, which of the questions we're answering here today, is it about how you help communities, or is it about what you learn from what you know? The latter is an academic one. Less of it.
Well, so, and this is where,
I'm totally convinced that.
well, I think, thinking about
Later.
different things. Is design research, since we're looking at the study of making, like how communities make stuff becomes academic research too.
No, but that's what I said, how communities make sense, like it's studying and understanding how they do that, that's different from how you help them do that.
Right.
That's not an academic.
Agreed.
That's my.
So
I
they're-
tried to explain this to Greg too, because both of you underappreciate how important you are in the process. How, quite frankly, if you,
My image.
well, so in my world, what I would argue is how bad you could be evil should you choose to have been. Right? I mean, so that's what I look at is Facebook, who creates communities and then screws with me. Thank goodness you're the good guy, right? But what do we do? Right. Right, so, so you fit several different places. For me, the question is which of those places you want to come first.
Well, I mean, again.
The second one, there's tons of, but you're not gonna, like what you're talking about, you're not necessarily gonna come to it, because it's gonna use different terminology. But, tech makers who make spaces and then
Yeah.
pretend like you're part of the rules and stuff, have a choice to be evil or bad, or to automate it, and outsource it to robots, right? This is a hot topic, right? But you and I have always gelled because I'm like, yeah, fun stuff, hot topic. But meanwhile, the water department can't figure out how to convince us all to put water sensors on our meters. And actually it's had a massive impact, and they've done it right. They don't surveil us. They don't misuse it. They haven't identified that I have COVID through my pee in the water, right? They could have. So, and they did none of it, right? Because they did it right, but they talked about data governance with us from the beginning and said, look, you're gonna do a good thing. So don't misuse the trust. So it's actually several different.
I mean, part of, presenting, is, and I wasn't sure when in learn to present, but.
No, this is perfect.
Is that,
I was worried.
you now heard this, what you're asking is totally right. Part of it is, I don't have answers to this, like, where do I, document this as, there's a role for this as academic knowledge. it has to come through useful to communities. So you kind of need to make sure it's useful because it's not useful unless it work with you. But then also navigating that back up to academia. Also, because like I don't have a home at this point. Like,
Right. I mean, but going back to something we talked about earlier, right? Best dissertation is a done dissertation.
Yes.
So you could not care so much about the kinds of academic questions you need to answer, just answer them in 1,000 words you mentioned, right? So your real focus on being, you know, maybe I don't care what this degree does for me, much more about what I do for these people, right?
Yeah, but
Actually,
you need
well,
to-
well, so no, the point for me of doing the page was actually, oh, are you got?
I'm saying.
The point for me, because I mean, I didn't really need, it doesn't really open that many doors for me to, it's already at a university.
Already
I was
walked
actually at a higher level university than the one I have now after completing a PhD. But it was a chance to do research, like serious, this is a, topic that no one's gonna really pay me to do, and like I get to actually just spend several years like doing it, which is awesome. And, but this is where I'm doing a PhD because I also do agree with saying like theory matters and knowledge production does matter.
No, lo que tienes que ver.
But yeah, how does that situate? I mean, well, mentally the thesis is going to be done. There is still this question for me, like, so sure, I see some postdocs here and there, but like, what exactly, like, where I have a pretty clear agenda, like, where does that, like, how do we make that work and who's that gonna work?
Yeah.
you can imagine European universities having a.
Generally, that's what I was saying, I was like, I mean, like, I was like, so, I came back to the US, so I could live near family, I'm like, oh, but all this work's happening in Europe, so. So back to Europe I go, I don't know, but,
No.
yeah, no, that was that, because yeah, there was even I showed, I don't think it's into like that. This was at the university, it was at Delft or Eindhoven, where like, it's a PhD in social transformation, like it was explicitly about design interventions for design justice and like community making, right? That's the PhD, like, there's like, we don't have this problem, like, we know that we're intervening, that's the point. So, it was like, I don't think, it was about like countering extractivist models, models. I don't know if this would swing in America, that's not too much topic. I think even mine, like,
You think about people like them.
A little bit.
The whole thing that you can't avoid. Hypothetical to particular goals or
Yo no sé.
an economic
Chile.
to a broader question. Wisdom kind of fits in with wisdom's kind of like intelligence. Are like people straddle these. This is a really interesting phase.